great honor and privilege to have Professor Rifa'at El-Haj on our campus at our institute with some of the former students of his as well as their students, and welcome. This is going to be, as we announced earlier, going to be a formal exchange. I don't know what Professor El-Haj has to say today, but I don't think he's going to make a formal presentation. But it is what we had in mind, actually, was more like a tribute to him as well. And for that, by way of introduction, what I would like to do is to read a couple of pages that I wrote for him, which the context was actually, back in 2000, when I finished my dissertation, I applied for some jobs, and one of them was at Purdue University, and one of the supplicants of the reference letter was Professor Rifa'at El-Haj, and he was gracious enough to give a copy of the reference he wrote to me in a very unusual way. So actually, last year it was my turn because his former students nominated him for the Middle East Studies Association Mentoring Award, and then they solicited letters of recommendation to support his nomination, which eventually he was awarded with in 2017 MESA Mentoring Award. What I'm going to do is to read some sentences from the reference letters that I wrote for him to return the gesture that he did more than nearly 2 decades ago. And I think also this is my personal, more than his accomplishment, how we relate to him and what he means for me is what I'm about to convey. And I think when I say this, I believe that I will be speaking on behalf of my colleagues and others who have actually had a relationship with him. It's a privilege.
You're going to have to see me get more and more embarrassed.
It's a privilege to write this letter to support the nomination of Professor Rifa'at El-Haj for 2017 MESA Mentoring Award. The first time I met Professor El-Haj was in 1994, when I just began my graduate studies at Binghamton University under the supervision of the late Professor Donald Borat. Only a couple of years ago, had Professor El-Haj moved from California State University, Long Beach, finally to join his wife, my late wife Barbara, to Binghamton University, where she had been teaching for a long time. Although he was not formally my principal advisor, he read every sentence I wrote, suggested readings ranging from European to South Asian history, and most importantly, taught me how to read critically a scholarly work, thus showing the way for the possibility of building a critical, non-Eurocentric Ottoman historiography freed from nationalist anachronisms. 6 years forward, the following sentence I put in the acknowledgement of my dissertation I defended in 2000 summarizes the relationship I had with him during my graduate studies at Binghamton University. Quote, "If this dissertation has any merit, Rifa'at El-Haj's contribution must be acknowledged, without whom writing it might have been easier, but the end product would certainly have been less valuable." End quote. Indeed, working with him was not always easy in the beginning. His relentless criticism of the term papers and dissertation chapters was disheartening, and his demand from a sound scholarship that I often failed to provide was crippling. And yet, as I got to know him better, I started to appreciate the fact that he was driven more than anything by a moral purpose, to bring the Ottoman historiography in line with that of European in its theoretical sophistication, empirical richness, and intellectual erudition. He demanded no less from his students, and indeed from everyone in the field of Ottoman history. Even his mere presence in audience in academic conferences had an unnerving effect among paper presenters, knowing that he had no tolerance for shortcuts, trendy jargon, and shallow interpretations. And yet, at the same time, When his students presented his papers in early stages of their careers in scholarly conferences, we all felt his protective shield and rigorous defense of our work. When I returned to Binghamton University as a fellow, 11 years after I finished my graduate studies, now as an associate professor at the university in Turkey, we taught a seminar together. It was so encouraging and enviable to see him that, despite his age, preserved his enthusiasm and rigor that I remember of him towards his new students. Compared to his peers, just like in my case, he was not the principal supervisor of many of those students and did not have the signature of, quote, dissertation advisor in their work. And yet, Professor Abou El-Haj has, over the long span of his remarkable career, touched the lives of all of his students, both at the personal and intellectual level, and in numerous ways, perhaps more influential and formative in their careers. I feel extremely lucky to get to know him more than 2 decades ago and have him to read my work from early stages of my career onward. As I said more than a decade ago in my dissertation, if I had achieved anything in my work or teaching my own students, it is because I have always kept him in my mind and tried to follow his example. I
have one argument with this presentation. What is left is what you teach us as we pretend to be teaching. Because I don't see it as teaching, I see it as an exchange. I hate lecturing. It doesn't mean anything to me. But I feel the only way I learn is by exchange. And my attitude is an exchange between equal minds. Now, a beginning graduate student might think that they are contributing to us, right? I won't be here, and I wouldn't have lasted for more than 50 years in teaching. Scholarship is secondary for me. What kept me alive is what Cengiz is describing as exchange. Because my sophistication and my depth came from that. It didn't come from my mind reading sources. Because history is not a given. We make history, we write it. It's a human endeavor, and you have to figure out, especially historiographically, what kind of history are we engaged in? It's mostly, at least historiographically, it's part of the creation of the nation state. We're talking about 18th century, 19th century, so it's a very funny kind of connection, because the nation state, the primary purpose of a nation state is to establish a race. It's based on racism. I mean, just imagine very intellectually highfalutin thinking, basically to establish, create a race when there are no such thing. And of course, to figure out purposes to which history and historiography, modern European historiography, which I was trained in throughout my life. What Cengiz is describing in terms of my interaction with my students, in a way it helped me work out the meaning of the history I was doing, that freed me from the assumptions of modern historiography, which aims basically, as I said, it's repeating, establishing a race, a Turkish race, right, in Anatolia, or an Arab race in Syria, a Syrian race or Egyptian race, and so on. This is for the Middle East, and you can take it from Europe. And of course, for us, the irony is Europe was invented, the nation state has abandoned, basically, in principle, anyway, the nation state. And they are abandoning the notion and the meaning of nation states, or creating a larger entity, and of course we can figure out what that larger entity means, and what are its values and prejudices, and so on and so forth. So this is my reaction to changes. We can go two ways. I can give you some of my most recent thoughts since retirement, or have you, some of you know my work or are curious, raise questions, and we can have a public kind of exchange with you as witnesses and participants. So you choose which way you want to go.
Actually, we can do both, actually.
What?
We can do both.
Yeah.
Why don't you say, reflect on...
In my last significant Ottoman history, based on the center, because I did something on the Jerusalem Qaza in the 16th century, based again on local Qazi sigils. Material I collected in the 60s in Jerusalem from the Qazi sigils, and I didn't write it till about 6 or 7 years ago. It's published as part of a festschrift for his Lowry. The way, the shield behind which the framework that I use is summarized, I think, in the second or third paragraph of the preface to my last book, which is called The Formation of the Modern State, which is not my title. The publisher, of course, misunderstood it and insisted that this will sell more than the title that I gave, which was much more tentative. Anyway, the focus and justification for why I was doing Ottoman history, I start by saying, remember, it's if history is a science, then Ottoman history has to be treated as any other history. And basically what I'm saying there is, in my training and throughout the years I've been in the West, Ottoman history was really never treated as a normal history or an equal history. So this is the shield behind which I actually was able to protect myself. Okay, these are your conditions on how we should do history. When you do your own history and you claim science, this is historical science, then why aren't you treating Ottoman history as a valid in and of itself? Why does it have to be looked through the filter of other cultures, other civilizations? And for me, the arrogance of the assumptions is the inferiority of the society that created Ottoman history. The society that, being born an Arab and Muslim, to some extent share with you, has also acculturated with the same values. And I'll tell somebody on the drive here that I knew that my two grandfathers in Jerusalem fought in World War I as Ottoman soldiers. My parental, my father's father died in the war. My mother's father lived, and when I came back to him after I've learned Turkish and said Nasılsınız, I saw the broadest, most beautiful smile on his face. It reminded him of his history, who he is and what he was. Anyway, so I really moved beyond history as a science to try to understand this last statement I'm making. I'm going to be bold, and you may be offended by what I'm saying, but I don't care. You just have to contend with it, and you can fight me back. But I understand my society, and I want to say this also, my view about Ottoman history is implied here too. And I know a lot of my students are going to be offended by what I'm saying. I'm going to say, I don't understand how can you work on the 19th and 20th century without knowing Ottoman history before that. I mean, for me, that's the context. Then in a way, there's justification for it. But really, the line I wanted to push and the insight that I gained is that I feel it's more than just science, history as a science. I feel that I belong to a culture. And I want you to think, how are we formed culturally? Because I am going to talk about my own biography and my own conclusion, which might sound bizarre for some of you, or for you, for all of you. But it means that to me, personally, my own biography. When Cengiz was pointing out that in practically every conference I attended, and you were in some of them, the questions that I asked seemed to either generate hostility, arrogance. In one instance, I was having a discussion with a PhD candidate in Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard, and he's a famous, prominent man now in Oxford. And he's still a graduate student. I was already a full professor. I was maybe in my 50s. And he said to me dismissively, before we went on talking, I don't want to insult you. And he walked away. Roger Owen, I mean, some of you might know, Middle Eastern history, gave a lecture at UCLA in Los Angeles. My sister Samira, who is a historian, became a historian as well, and I attended his presentation. And in these cases, it's not important for me the questions I ask, the subject is discussed. It's the reaction to the question. First and foremost, never answered, never honored as a legitimate question. I mean, try to imagine what that means. And also, I have remained puzzled as to where did these questions come from. But they didn't come from my education, my formal education in America and in Palestine. I went to an English missionary school. Its purpose was to convert Muslims to Christians, basically. That's what missionaries tried to do in the 20th century. The Ottomans didn't allow them to do it in the 19th century, but by British control, they could at least pretend to. So the question, if in fact these questions do not come from my education, my formal education, and I'm going to have to brag, I went to the best colleges, the top-notch university in the United States, one of the first 2 or 3, Princeton. I got my PhD at Princeton, and I did a very demanding program called Russian, European, and Middle Eastern history. And I was examined in those 3 and supposedly qualified to do that. The only area I could and I wanted to develop was Middle Eastern. So it's not my education. When I am a conscious person, starting from 3rd grade, as one of you I think mentioned, the last couple of days. I started the 3rd grade in missions. So this is where I begin to shift from trying to understand history, from history as a science to history as culture. And the question becomes, if we are talking about acculturation and your formal education, all right, is not what actually informs your culture, your acculturation. What does? And you know, as I said, some of you might be saying, I'm naive, and I'm happy to be naive. I think our basic acculturation comes from our mothers. They are the ones. And I'm not talking about Quran, I'm talking about how we look at each other as human beings. It's embedded in us. It's passed on to us almost physically. And so that becomes, at least, this is at least my conclusion about my own insight as to where my view of life, humans, even history comes from. It's not from my formal education. As I said, my formal education is completely European and American. It has nothing to do with my Imam Qasim in any way, and he is the one I love the most. Okay. This is it. Is that enough an introduction?
The floor is open for any comments, questions, provocations.
Maybe. You said that the publishing house wanted your book, the formation of the modern state. Probably you had another title in your mind. What was it? Instead of formation of modern state?
Modern state. And I define the state there through Andres Tisa. So basically, we're not talking about the state, we're talking about the political formation in form. And the way, I mean, most of the research I've done in Ottoman history, I would just have to tell you, I can't claim to be an Ottoman historian. I've done serious research in about 35 or 40 years of Ottoman history in the 70s and the beginning of the 18th century. And I started with the notion that if there is a substitute for a different authority than the Sultan as the leader, political leader, we're saying the Wazir and Pasha households are the ones that took over. So in other words, it's diffused power, political power diffused. Now, so it's just to make this claim. So the first step I did is to create a biographical dictionary. And at the time, we didn't have computers, so everything I did by hand. I have something like 18,000 cards with the biographies on them. So that became my base, basically. This is the core of my argument for 35 years. And the next step, and again in European historiography, they say if you want to study a particular moment, you can really study it in a disruption period, not in a normal period. So revolutions, coup d'etats, whatever it is, political interruptions, become an occasion where you see the breakdown. All right? So the next step in my work, I wrote a book on what I call the incident or the rebellion of 1703, which again is a struggle between Mustafa II and the Wazir and Pasha household. He set them aside, and then again, to me it was illustrates again how alive and dynamic Ottoman history is at this time. And this is, remember, this is the period that Europeans and Americans think is the decline period. Okay. So, in the rebellion in 1703, the Wazir and Pasha households regained power. Mustafa II is defeated. Karlovitz is the culmination of diplomacy, where the Ottomans conceded territory. And I met a friend of Qasim last night who does work on Ottoman, Austrian treaties in the 17th century, in which in one of the negotiations the Austrians were trying to dictate to the Ottomans by telling them, if you want peace, you have to concede these territories. In other words, other than defeat, you are at the humiliation of having to give up. Anyway, this is basically what the sum of it. Whereas at Karlovitz, the negotiation based on equality. Whatever you held is yours. You can't dictate to the others what you want from their territory. So that is another phenomenon that again is exception to Abdullah's program and research. So anyway, to sum up again, it's and basically, as I can really claim myself to be an Ottoman historian based on about 35 years of work on basically creating an evidence base from which to reconstruct the history, and an argument saying that political power has moved from the dynasty. And it's not a divine revelation or insight, it's just a mundane one. But what it proves for me, and again I'm discovering this because these are the assumptions with which I came to studying Ottoman history. That it's a normal history, it's a living society. And I started by seeing it as a living society. And I'm going to give you an example of a bizarre sense of how I sensed I was doing Ottoman history. And I didn't know at the time that I had that experience. That it is related to understanding it as a living history. When I came to do my research in the archives in 1960, I was walking again in the area close to the archives, the middle period of the archives. Now I gather it's a new building and so on. But anyway, and this you can think is bizarre, but I had a sense. This chief Ottoman negotiator, his name was Rami Mehmed Efendi. He was raised in Qatar. I had felt a sense of the presence of Rami Mehmed Efendi. Right just behind me as I was walking. In other words, my attitude, my approach, now I'm interpreting, it's not something that I interpreted at the time, that Ottoman society in the 17th century was a living society for me. And the proof, maybe it's a fallacious conjuring on my part, my imagination, is that here's the living Rami Mehmed walking along with me in the old city or something. That's it. Any question, other questions or issues?
We are all influenced by political, cultural development of our eras. 1970s, late 1970s, Edward Said wrote his influential book Orientalism, and people were grasping in different ways, Eurocentrism, Orientalism, and so on and so forth. I was wondering whether in your lifetime, in recent years, for example, taking into consideration what has been going on in the world, in the Middle East, and everywhere, there are a lot of political developments. I was wondering whether you had felt in any way a sense of different way of looking at those theoretical tools and concepts compared to what you have been doing in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Is there a rupture or nothing's changed at all? I was wondering your personal engagement with those influential theories in time.
I'm going to just start by answering you by reiterating that I was raised to be an optimist. And you talk about disruption and so on. I still take the optimistic side, and that's the way I was raised. And so I don't understand what you're saying as ruptures. I try to historicize these changes without losing my orientation. In other words, it doesn't shake me to say a disruption, political disruption, or a different way of doing it. Because as a historian, I think it is my job to try to explain why these things take place at that point. I was giving a lecture at Qasim's University, and somebody asked me, what do you think of modern Turkish historiography of the Ottoman period? And it was completely clear for me. I don't have the means. I haven't lived in this society. And it would be arrogant for me to start to say, I can play around and think theoretically, but it has nothing to do with reality. Because whatever historiography, talking about, whatever historiography is produced, it's not God-made, it's not from somewhere else. You, this society, is making it, and this defines you. Ottoman history, you use to define you. It actually doesn't define you. Because my view is that each generation, that's the only thing for me that makes sense, each generation writes its own history. We don't learn how to look at our society and the future from our history. If it is going to be our history, we have, first of all, to make it, but even more important, own up to it. Really to say, I am the one who's doing it. So you can't say somebody else is to blame for it. And if you are here, you are participating in it. You might be participating in resisting, but you are participating. It's not passive. So that's how I approach a question like you want to do. I know it might be an escape, but that's what I do. Offended. I don't hear very well, so you're going to have to shout so I can hear you. Please.
I will ask about something Rami Mehmet you just said. You just like kind of, summon a ghost from past, you just like kind of... It's like kind of...
Won't you come closer, because I can actually, I want to follow what you're saying, okay? Yeah. Try to shout at me, okay?
I want to ask about Rami Mehmet Pasha. You just said, you just said if it is here, it's like kind of summoning a ghost from the past. You just like call it, so it is in the present. So what do you think about his second life? With you. What does that mean for you? In his second life, next to you, how can we understand it? How can we?
What second life are you talking about?
When you think of him next to you, it is coming from the past, and you kind of think about it.
I'm going to help actually for you to falsify my feeling about Rami Mehmet. Okay? I'm basically, I can admit that I invented Rami Mehmet's presence. Rami Mehmet didn't come to me. I'm talking about my attitude and my interpretation of it, even if it is political. Because the way I was really raised to be an optimist, which means I have to trust my feelings. And this sense you're asking, I accept Paul totally. It's you know, in earlier developments in human civilization, we did believe in these extrasensory perceptions and conjuring up other spirits and so on. I'm using that not in this sense. I'm really saying in a way, for your sake, it's wishful thinking. I'm inventing Rami Mehmet, all right, to be walking next to me to confirm that he was a living person, and that when I was studying him, and this is how I didn't think about it, this is how I proceeded. It's only in these last few years, actually in my retirement, am I able to make these connections. And I said to you, I'm going to say some bizarre things. I don't expect you to replicate them or accept them, but I'm trying to present my story and how I understand it. I think you're really asking a more fundamental question. The fundamental question for me is how I went into Ottoman history. I went to Princeton. At the time, the department gave me a fellowship of 5-6 years, full fellowship. It was called Oriental Studies. So the Orientalist paradigm was in full function there. So I'm saying that the orientation that I was trained in, and this is again what I say about acculturation. The orientation actually did not penetrate. I objected to that attitude. And when I say Mali Mehmet was used to me, they think that when they're studying Ottoman society at this time, it's a dead society, a suspense society. There is no creativity. And perhaps it's wishful thinking. I don't think wishful thinking on my part to invent it, to boost my illusion that it is a living society. But that's how I'm going to be. I don't know if I answered.
Thank you.
If I haven't, come back at me, okay?
I might have a very bizarre question.
I like bizarre questions.
I'm trying to understand whether you're presenting us with a very interesting and challenging argument on how we build knowledge, because I was very intrigued by the way you brought in your biography. So if I understand correctly, you're suggesting that it wasn't your formal training that provides you with the critical questions, but your lived experience, your acculturation. I'm feeling that that's opening a way for us, the way we build knowledge, because we always have this idea, it's the formal training, we have to read the theories, and we have to find the ideas in that theory. But I am also a person who thinks that we have to challenge this distinction between theory and daily life and lived experience. It's sometimes like the intuitions, the gut feelings you developed from lived experience that can help you to look back on existing theory. Is this something you're suggesting?
I absolutely understand what you're saying.
Because I find it very intriguing and very important.
But the way I would put it is different. My training, the way I understand it, of course that was not the goal, but I understand it, is that my training is based on logic, external thinking, our mind. And what I find Now, later on in my life, as I'm retired, I'm very late. In other words, my insights have no guide to anybody because I'm already passé. Okay. Is that if I didn't have a feeling, and I say that to all historians, all social scientists, if what your work doesn't reflect you, then it's false. I'm going to say that arrogantly, okay? It doesn't relate to you personally. In other words, if it isn't your biography, and that's how I see, ultimately, that basically I'm discovering that what I was studying really was building my biography. Where did I come from? Now, others, like me, chose other fields and so on. But for me, what makes sense is that, as I said, consciously, and there, in formal education, there is no subconscious except the assumptions of the people who have our curriculums and so on. It's very conscious. And I have to tell you that when I graduated from college, the foreign student advisor told me he was disappointed that I hadn't converted to Christianity. And this is we're talking 56, we're not talking about 1850. So, I mean, the underlying assumption behind the people who educated me, a lot of them, was that, I'm coming to be enlightened, and of course the culmination of my enlightenment is conversion, right? And how did I resist? And I wasn't brought up in the Kutab, I wasn't brought up in a traditional school, I was brought up in a completely modern European model of schooling. But I think, I've hinted at it, but when I came here this time, I felt at home. And I felt I was coming to a place where if I had another life, this is where I want to live. And that doesn't come from, my upbringing. I am actually interpreting my biography. Okay. And I think that if your feelings and your biography doesn't inform your scholarship, it doesn't enhance you. It will die, and you'll die sooner than you need to. Offended, yes, I knew that's going to come from you.
No, actually, I think this is slightly provocative perhaps, but I'm really curious.
I need the provocation. Oh,
what do you think about the secularism debates in Turkey these days in terms of informing the historical reconstruction of the Ottoman past? Because obviously it's a battlefield, right? And part of my personal history is very secular. And the way I look at the Ottoman history now is through the lens of this westernizing project in some ways. And of course I know that the deeper history, so to speak, is not so secular or secular in the Western sense. But at the same time, currently, as you said, history is a battlefield, as it always is. And now currently, it's really hard to distinguish between these two visions of secularism. In a sense, I don't know if I can communicate.
I'm trying to follow. Go ahead.
So in a sense, I'm wondering what your take would be on this question of secularism and how it impacts, how different interpretations of secularism impacts the way we study Ottoman history. And here, to add perhaps one more layer, I have a book in mind that perhaps you might also have read, Sabah Mahmud's, Minority Report, what was the exact title, I can't remember, but it was something like the religious difference in an age of secularism, so on and so forth. So on the one hand, it seems to take the Ottoman way of looking at secularism very seriously, but on the other hand, it was criticized heavily in Turkey when she came back in 2015 to talk about, and perhaps in a sense, favored the Ottoman way of secularism against the wills of the, center-left or left type of people in this university. So I just wondered what your take on this debate on secularism.
And again, you know what I said, for me, what your question asks is very obvious. It's not, I don't find it taxing or overcomplicated. First of all, and I say this and say it in front of my Imam Qasim.
Qasim is our Imam at Binghamton, by the way. He's a faculty member at Shahid University right now. He lived in Binghamton almost 20 years as the Imam of Binghamton, the town. And he's also the Imam of Rifa'at and also all the Turkish students.
And I'm an atheist. Okay, so
he gave us a lot of fatwa about how helpful, how good drinking.
I think you're asking a very profound question. And I'm going to tell you how I resolved in my own mind. I am secular. Okay? So I don't believe that I am created. And even if I was created, I assume somebody created us and left us on our own. I don't think if there's a God, Allah, and I hope there is for our sake, then He put us on this earth and He said, you live your life. That's how I understand it. So everything else having to do with religion, I don't think has anything to do with God or religion. It has to do with how we use religion to justify. So if you're talking about 19th century Islam, it's a complete thing. Islam, most people think it's rigid. There's a term that Qasim and I were talking about called tajaddud, renewal. In classical Islamic theology, which means renewal. Every 100 years, there's a renewal. What does that mean?